Aloha, namaskar, and hello. My name is Anu Hittel, and I'm broadcasting live from ThinkTech Studios in beautiful downtown Honolulu. My show, Climate Change Beyond Outrage, talks about going beyond outrage to look at solutions to climate problems facing people, nations, and the world. You can also join this commentary by tweeting us at ThinkTechHI. After last month's climate negotiations in Paris at the COP21, people have been asking, and rightly so, what do these negotiations mean for climate change? How effective were they? Do we need yet another international agreement? All of these are fair questions. And today, we will talk a little bit about that. I like to think of what Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, economist at Columbia University, says about the agreement. Basically, he says, the politicians and the diplomats have done their job. They've come up with an agreement. They've pointed us in the right direction. Now to implement, and that is the job of the rest of us. So today we will talk with someone who is in the studio who has been doing just that, implementing local solutions here in Hawaii and the wider Pacific to a global problem of climate change. I have with me today Dr. Jeff Burgett from the Pacific Island Climate Change Cooperative. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you for coming and for joining us. So today, we plan to talk with you about forest birds in Hawaii. And first, I'd like to mention that you are the science coordinator at the Pacific Islands Climate Change Cooperative.
Yes.
And it's fondly called PIXI.
PIXI.
Am I
It's
correct?
a lot easier to say, yes.
Okay, good. That's a lot easier. It is another acronym, but I think we can remember that one better.
But it's a friendly acronym.
A friendly one, yes. We like friendly acronyms. So Jeff, if I may call you that, is the science coordinator at PIXI, and his background is in biology. He has a doctorate from UH Manoa, that is the University of Hawaii, Manoa. And he has worked on climate issues since 2007. Yes? So today, in this hour, what we would like to do, hopefully, is talk about forest birds, the challenges you face, the problems, the extinction problems, all of those things. And then let's also look at how you've helped these natural communities to adapt to climate change. And then next we'll go on to looking at how how human communities are adapting to climate change and how the work of PIXI and what you've done helps with that.
Okay, sounds great.
Wonderful. So just to give a little background, I believe that there used to be, at least according to the Department of Land and Natural Resources, over 150 bird species that were unique to the Hawaiian Islands. And in the past 200 years, perhaps, now we're down to about 40 species and not very robust populations of those species. Is that right?
That's right. Well, Hawaii was probably, everyone's heard of the Galapagos Islands and their unique species. Hawaii was probably, before human arrival about 1,000 years ago, was actually far more diverse, and the bird fauna was much more amazing and beautiful. Many of those birds didn't survive initial human colonization of the islands.
Why is that?
Probably it wasn't direct hunting by the Polynesians that arrived here, but the consequences of some of the land use practices they needed in order to cultivate crops, they had to clear some forest. And also they introduced inadvertently probably some major pests, the main one being the Polynesian rat, which throughout the Pacific followed humans as they moved from island to island and is responsible for probably more extinctions than any other species on Earth, actually. So the birds...
Similar problems in Easter Island and so on as well.
Right. The species that evolved here found essentially no predators on the ground. All of the only predators were other birds.
Interesting. So Hawaii had no land mammals.
It had no land mammals at all,
Only
except
marine
for
mammals and the Hawaiian bat.
Hawaiian bat. There were actually two bats. One is now extinct, but the other one is still around.
Okay. So here these birds had evolved laying their eggs on the ground, perhaps?
Many of them did. Many of the other ones, basically, even though they lay their egg nest in, make their nest in trees, they don't have any behavioral defense against predators. They'll kind of sit there and watch the rat come and eat them. So it's just they were here for millions of years without those predators, and so they lost those behaviors. In many times, people think that species go extinct because there's something wrong with them, but it's not really true. For instance, humans have not evolved much resistance to Ebola virus, right? So that will kill us very easily, but nobody says, well, humans are weak because they're not strong. So species adapt to their environment, and they become really good at living there, but when the situation changes, when new factors are introduced, often they can't cope.
And so when we had the arrival of humans, that was a new situation for these species, and then the arrival of other mammals that they brought, such as the rat. And now we have something else that humans have created, climate change.
Yeah, that kind of overarches everything, because while there are ways that you could control any of these threats, such as rats, you can build a fence to keep rats out. You can build a fence to keep cats out. You can get rid of if the degradation of the forest is a problem, you can start changing the situation there and replanting. But climate change is pervasive, and so it's changing the basic ground on which we walk almost. And so for species in Hawaii and other places that are very vulnerable to these changes, it really presents a unique set of problems that we haven't encountered before, and we have to develop new techniques to deal with.
So tell us about how climate change has changed the equation for these birds. So at this point, we're saying there are about 40 species of those, and when we speak about these species, it's the native species, the species that are native, and are they endemic to the, unique to the islands?
Most of the forest birds, yeah, the forest birds are endemic, which means they evolved only here. They are derived from ancestors from elsewhere, but over millions of years have changed into a multitude of species that are found only on one island in many cases, or on a couple islands. So the birds are found only here. They can't, the conditions under which they live are specific to Hawaii. The plants that they pollinate and the nectar that they drink is specific to the plants here. So they really can't go anywhere else.
So the plants disappear, the birds disappear.
Luckily, we're working real hard to keep both of those around. Actually, it's not Pixie so much as the wider conservation community that has been working tirelessly for decades on these problems. Our role is basically to look at climate change as a new factor and try to help managers adapt what they're already doing, which is a considerable amount, to this new factor that previously was not part of their planning. It didn't have to be.
So when you say that there are efforts to conserve these forest birds, what kinds of things stand out in your mind? Like what sorts of things have happened that are major efforts?
Primarily, well, the first thing was actually when they, in the late 70s, they did a series of surveys to find out where these birds were. Because most people in Hawaii that live here, many of the people who have lived there their entire lives have never seen a native forest bird, because the environment in the lower areas where people tend to spend all their time has changed so dramatically. The native forest is long gone, and there's also a disease here, which we'll talk about in a bit. But so that means that the native forest birds tend to be confined to very high elevations. People that go to Volcanoes National Park, for instance, or Haleakala, often see birds that they've never seen before because they're confined now to those upper elevations. And I'm sorry, I forgot your first part of your question.
I forget it too, so no, I actually was wondering what were the major efforts that, that have led up to what you folks are doing at this point.
Right, so in the late 70s, there was a series of surveys to find out where the birds were, because really, they really didn't know where all the birds were. So that was a multi-year effort with an enormous number of volunteers, and they mapped out where the native birds were, and then focused on trying to set aside some of those areas and protect them. And so that led to the establishment of several national wildlife refuges and state protected areas. And when you have an area that's designated for conservation like that, we can do things to help the forest recover if it's under threat. One of the main threats is ungulates, hoofed mammals like goats and sheep and cattle and pigs, and those really are tough on the forest. The plants have no resistance to them, and so over the years, these animals have actually caused a lot of forest loss. And so even in the territorial days, this was understood, and a series of fences were erected across the state or the territory at the time, to get those animals out of the forest, to preserve the forest for watershed purposes. So once we knew where the birds were, we could redouble efforts to protect the forest, and the forest actually bounces back if you get the animals out.
Well, let's take a look at what's on the screen and this map. It comes from a vulnerability assessment that you folks have done?
That's right. We have, there's a scientist on our staff, Lucas Fortini, who, with colleagues at several agencies in Honolulu, developed this vulnerability assessment, which is essentially a mathematical model of bird distributions, where they live now and where they might live in the future. Because as climate change moves forward, we're going to see warmer temperatures, and that's going to change the temperature in the forest. Specifically on a mountain, the upper elevations are cooler. And so as the general temperature warms, a given temperature zone will tend to move up the mountain.
And so what are we seeing on that, if we could have that map back again, what are we seeing actually? What are the red zones? What are the green zones?
Well, so for each of the forest bird species that Lucas modeled, we looked at where they live now and where their temperature zone that represents their best habitat would be in the future. And the areas that are in red and green are areas where the birds live now. And the red zone shows where, by the end of this century, the temperatures will be too warm for the birds to live there, but not because the birds can't handle warm temperatures, but because of a disease problem that I'll talk about in a minute. The yellow areas are areas that are even higher elevation that might become suitable for these birds if there's forest there. In some of those areas, there's not good forest. So the red zones will be essentially lost range, and the yellow zones are gained range, but you can see that generally there's much more lost than gained. And so the green zones are where we project that these birds, this is the eevee, the bright red long-billed bird that people are familiar with. That is, the green zone is where they're likely to still persist by the year 2100.
So essentially this survey took, or this modeling effort took previous surveys and a current survey perhaps, and then projected it into the future. Right.
They used all of the locations that they knew these birds were, and there's a picture of the eevee, a beautiful bird.
It is.
And correlated those with the temperature at which in those locations, and then you move into the future, and those temperatures change. The reasons why, and I just need to let people know, like I said, the eevee and these other forest birds can take warm temperatures. They used to live all the way down to sea level. But it's the diseases that humans have brought in and the mosquitoes that are carriers of those diseases that's caused these birds to be confined to the upper elevations.
And let's talk a little bit more about that and the challenges that you folks face once we come back. So don't go away. We're going to talk about, are these birds doomed?
Aloha, I'm Rachel Yergin with Aging with Grace. Please join us every Tuesday on thinktech.com.
Hello, I'm Stephen Katz, and I'm the host of Shrink Wrap, which comes to you live every Tuesday at 3 p.m. on thinktechhawaii.com, and then it's repeated again whenever you want if you go to the website. On our show, we will be talking to all different kinds of therapists, psychologists, psychoanalysts, psychiatrists, people who talk about the mind, the brain, and about different ways to find happiness I myself am a marriage and family therapist in practice here in Hawaii, and I hope you will join us because I've got a lot to learn, you've got a lot to learn, and it's a great ride. Thanks a lot. See you soon.
Aloha and welcome back. So we are here in the studio with Jeff Burgett, Science Coordinator with the Pacific Islands Climate Change Cooperative. And we're talking about forest birds in Hawaii, birds that are native to the Hawaiian Islands. And the challenges in this segment, the challenges that we face and that conservationists face in trying to preserve these birds and to make their numbers more robust. So when we left off, we were talking a little bit about the challenge to the bird populations from avian malaria.
Right, that's the primary disease that's caused their ranges to be restricted to these upper forests.
Is this a result of climate change?
No, initially it's the result of the introduction of mosquitoes, because the mosquitoes weren't native here. There were no mosquitoes in Hawaii before.
Imagine that, it was paradise.
Yes, before the 1820s, and when they were actually introduced by a Western sailing ship. And since then, there have been repeated introductions of other mosquitoes as trade has increased across Hawaii. So the mosquitoes were mosquitoes that like to bite birds, and they transmit a malaria that doesn't affect people, but is actually deadly to many forest birds. And so a lot of the forest birds that you talked about disappearing in the last 200 years, many of those disappeared in the years from 1900 to about 1890 to about 1920. There was a massive die-off of native forest birds. So we're seeing the survivors now, but their ranges are much restricted, and they live in areas where the mosquitoes don't like to live. It's too cold for them, and it's also too cold for the parasite, the malaria parasite. So as temperatures warm, that area will go up, and so the area that the birds can live in gets smaller and smaller. The habitat is still there. The forest is still beautiful. It's just it's full of this disease-carrying mosquito, and so the birds can't survive there unless the mosquito is dealt with. And that's actually what our vulnerability assessment pointed to as a clear need right now.
And so are there efforts to deal with these mosquitoes? I mean, do you spray them? Do you? Well,
mosquitoes are tough. I mean, everybody knows that they're hard to get rid of, and they're a major health threat globally. There are a lot of new technologies that are being looked at in terms of being able to modify the populations, reduce the populations with non-chemical means, and I think that's really important because nobody wants to spray the forest with pesticides or anything like that.
Right, because that would also have an effect on the birds.
On the birds and on the entire ecosystem. So since mosquitoes are not native, they're an alien species and they're causing problems and nobody likes them. I don't think there are many fans of mosquitoes. So,
no mosquito conservation society.
Right, not that we know of. So on other places, in places where mosquitoes are native, they actually have a good ecosystem function, but in Hawaii, not so much. So there's some technologies on the horizon that are being investigated right now as ways to break the cycle, the link between temperature and disease. If we prevent temperature from basically determining where these birds can live, then they can live in the forest that's perfectly available to them, except for the disease problem. So if the mosquito or the malaria problem is somehow tweaked, that opens up an enormous area of habitat that's under conservation management now and is really good habitat that the birds could recolonize and their populations could increase.
So is there something going on with the mosquitoes that are there efforts to somehow modify these organisms?
Well, there's 2 or 3 different major threads of this technology, and of course it's based on understanding genetics of mosquitoes and the parasite, which is accelerating at a huge rate. But it's mainly driven by the human disease, the need to combat human disease. And for instance, the Zika virus is in the news. That's carried by a mosquito that's here in Hawaii. Mm-hmm. And so people want to find ways to deal with the threat that mosquitoes pose to people. As a side benefit, we'll be able to use those techniques, hopefully, to help the birds.
So we might actually have genetically modified organisms working to our benefit.
There's a lot of steps between now and then. So
maybe. But I know, as a scientist, you can't say anything outright.
No.
That's right. So, So tell us a little bit about the shrinking habitat, essentially, is what they've got, even though the forest
shrinking
is still
range.
yes, the range, shrinking range, even
right.
though the forests are still there.
Right.
Where are these birds going to go? Is there I know that with some of the non-endangered birds, there are efforts to look at what's happening on the low-lying Hawaiian Islands for seabirds, and to
Right.
see if they can perhaps establish new colonies in on the higher islands.
Right. So
is there something like that that's being considered? Or?
Well, some of the birds, like this map is about the eevee, and there's still by the end of this century, there's still considerable habitat, all of that green area and the orange area. Other species don't fare as well. Each species is a little different in how, so there are species that are very, very sensitive, and there are islands that are more of a problem because they don't extend as high as the Big Island or Maui. And the prime example there is the island of Kauai, where there are two endemic honey creepers, the akikiki and the akike'e, that are rapidly decreasing in population. I mean, quite alarmingly. And that's because the island of Kauai has a plateau at the top, the Alakai Plateau, and it doesn't extend further up into the cooler areas. So they have nowhere to go. They're at the top of the mountain, and that's as far as they can go. So their populations are decreasing so quickly that some conservationists have urged that people look at the idea of moving them to islands that they have never occurred on, but where there might be habitat that they could live in while these solutions are developed.
So taking them outside of their range.
Outside of their historic range, which
and
causes...
this is interesting because this is usually when we talk about conservationists wanting to do things, the conflict comes more from conservationists and non-conservationists, right? But here there's a debate within the conservation community, which I think is interesting, where some conservationists feel that the only hope for these birds perhaps is moving outside of the historic range. And this is something that I found even for plants, and it's not restricted only to birds.
Right, this is controversial, but it wasn't really a big point of discussion in conservation until the realities of climate change really became apparent, where it's obvious in many cases, that species essentially will not have any native range anymore. They'll have to go somewhere. Where is that going to be, and do they need help moving? So the entire problem is called assisted colonization or assisted migration, and that you will need to actually expend human effort to move these species to places where they can live in the future.
Very interesting. And also, is this something that's somewhat hindered by the current avatar, if you will, of the Endangered Species Act, which is that it was established in 1973, passed by Congress during the Nixon administration, and basically is for species. I don't think they ever thought that it would be used in this manner, but you know, it's certainly times have changed since then, and it really doesn't encourage you to take things outside of the range and to protect these species outside of their range. So is that something that's going to pose a problem? Is that something that we should be looking at for when the next round of Endangered Species Act hearings come up, that we should be looking at trying to push for something like this?
Well, you're right. The law was designed for what appeared to be the problems of the time, which were overhunting and pollution and DDT and things like that. So, and development, destroying habitat. And it's really good for that. It gives us a lot of tools for that. But it doesn't give you tools against climate, obviously. And so, and it was conceived at the time, and still in many cases, people's idea of conservation is you save the habitat, you prevent the bad things that are happening there from happening, and everything will be fine. If you don't cut down the forest, then the chimpanzees can still live there, kind of thing. But if the conditions are changing in that habitat to render it very difficult for species to live there, they have to move or have to live somewhere else and track that change across the landscape, then you run into this problem, which you described, which is that the Endangered Species Act assumes that you're going to be putting them back into their historical range. So if a species has never occurred somewhere that it needs to go, that sets up a policy problem that has yet to be resolved.
Will there be a problem for other species around in that habitat as well? I assume that would be something that people would look into and scientists would work on which would be the best habitat to translocate or establish new colonies and
yeah, well, I think people in Hawaii are very familiar with the story of the mongoose and how it seemed like a good idea at the time and didn't turn out to be such a good idea. And those same sort of concerns are around this idea of assisted colonization. You may introduce something to an area that it goes wild in, or your introduction may have an impact on the species that are already there that you want to also save. So all of these things obviously are part of the internal discussion within the conservation community, and eventually as the possibilities get more explored, that conservation will become a conversation, will become part of the public dialogue. But we're still just trying to find out what might work.
That's right. And I know that they're trying to look at some of these issues even with non-endangered birds, like some of the seabirds and so on for the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. So there are some interesting pushing the envelope of conservation and in the face of climate change and threats from climate change. So one question that, of course, comes to mind when we look at how much money and time and resources go into the conservation of forest birds or any species, we always ask the question, why do we care?
Is it worth it? Why bother? Yeah.
And of course, you care and I care, and there are some other people who care, but why should we all care about this? And one of the things that I thought was very interesting in the work you do is the sort of biocultural aspect of conservation. And in Hawaii, that is just, these forest birds are in Hawaiian song, in hula, in chants, and you know, I feel that it's something that's so tied in with the culture. So even though when you said that people have not actually seen these birds, but they certainly have seen them in paintings and have known them and grown up with them in some ways, if they are to any extent native Hawaiian. And so you know, what do you say to people who say, well, why would we care?
Well, Hawaii is such a unique place on Earth. There's no place else like it. And part of that is the environment. Everybody here that lives here for any length of time, especially if you're born here and have roots deep into the past of Hawaii, your culture, your feeling of home is intimately woven into the species that make up Hawaii. It's not a barren chunk of rock. It's a vibrant ecosystem, and it has been for millions of years. And those species are woven throughout Hawaiian culture, the understanding of natural cycles and of the ways that these species enrich us, both spiritually and materially, that's woven throughout the culture. One only has to go to the Bishop Museum and see the feather cloaks of the ali'i to realize that this was the wealth of the land. In fact, when they divided up the islands, the chiefs made sure that they had forests with birds in them, because that's how they could, it was like a gold mine. That's how they could show their wealth and their power of control over lands, was by the beautiful cloaks that they wore and the other feather adornments. So from the native Hawaiian perspective, these birds are hugely valuable. We've lost so many. We need to preserve what we have. Scientifically, they're a story of evolution without parallel. And just anybody that's actually ever gotten up into the forest and seen an iiwi sing is just, you'll never think of them any other way again. I mean, they need to be there.
They are spectacular and they are beautiful. I asked Jeff if he would read out his own quote, and he said no, so I will read it out for him, which is that the fate of these birds, my question is really, are they doomed? What can we do, and are they doomed? And the fate of these birds has not yet been determined. With this research, we can visualize the worst case scenario and begin mapping out solutions for a future where native birdsong continues to ring out in Hawaii's forests. So I think that's, you know, and do you feel that way, that they are,
Absolutely.
their future is still still in our hands?
The future is very much in our hands. And we have the means to take local action to deal with this global problem.
That's wonderful, and thank you for showing us how we can do that. Now, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we will talk about a community on Hawaii Island and how Pixie is helping to work with the folks who are trying to adapt to climate change issues there. So we'll see you right after the break.
Hi, I'm Ethan Allen, host of Likeable Science on Think Tech Hawaii. Come join us every Friday at 2 p.m. when I interview interesting scientists about what they do, why they do it, and why we should all care about it. It's a lot of fun to see. We hear, and you can learn interesting stuff. You'll hear all kinds of fascinating science, and we know you'll have a great time. Hope to see you then. Bye-bye.
Aloha, my name is Kirsten Baumgart-Turner, and I'm the host of Sustainable Hawaii at thinktechhawaii.com. We air live on the internet and also on Oceanic Channel 16. I'd invite you to come for a fresh new show every Tuesday from 12 to 1 o'clock. I try to bring on guests that give us a different viewpoint on aspects of sustainability in Hawaii, as well as trying to unpack some of the difficult concepts of measuring and achieving sustainability, particularly with regard to sustainable economic growth and prosperity in Hawaii. Please join us every Tuesday from 12 to 1 p.m. Mahalo, aloha.
Welcome back to Climate Change Beyond Outrage, where we discuss solutions to climate problems facing people, nations, and the world. And here we are with Jeff Burgett from the Pacific Islands Climate Change Cooperative, where they work not only on forest birds, but a whole lot of other things. And so we will talk a little bit about how they help human communities adapt to climate change as well, and their work with a specific community on the Big Island of Hawaii.
Yeah, this is a project is an example of a collaboration we did with, that we've started to do with communities around the Pacific. The focus on forest birds is an example of a project we did that focused on a particular tough scientific problem, projecting the future for these species. But there's a lot of known impacts that are going to occur across the Pacific and across communities, and we're interested in the ways in which people can actually take charge of their own destiny, which they have all along, but in terms of dealing with climate change as a new factor. So with two researchers at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, Tamara Tickton and Heather McMillan, we did this project with the community of Kaupulehu, which is north of Kailua on the Kona side of the Big Island. It's an area that goes all the way from the top of Hualalai all the way down to the coast and in the adjoining sea. And folks that live there have endured a lot of change over time. And it's not a benign environment as much. They of course, it's their land, they love it. They wouldn't be anywhere else, but it's a tough place to live.
When you say they've endured a lot of change, is that you're not just referring to climate change, you're saying?
No, over time, I mean, the folks that live there have seen, of course, the arrival of Europeans, the arrival of animals that are, on one hand, maybe useful, but on the other hand, sort of pesty, like goats, for instance. There's alien plants that have taken over the landscape, like fountain grass, which causes enormous fires in the area. But at the same time, this community...
And fires are a huge problem in Hawaii.
Fires are a big problem. They really attack the native forest and the native plants, which can't resist fire.
It's not just about houses getting burned up.
Whenever you see a brush fire, I kind of cringe, because some of that brush is really, really nice forest often. But in Kaupulehu, they have a history of kind of rolling with the punches and finding ways to deal with these issues that is really a testament to the resilience of the community. So this project explored that and gave a way for the community to actually map a timeline of change across the landscape and show how they have been able to deal with change and prosper in the face of change. And as part of that, They also did a, which you see on the screen now, they drafted a seasonal calendar.
Is that what they're doing in this picture?
Yeah, it was a collaborative effort by the community members to look at what changes on the landscape with the seasons. And the environment in Kaupalehu is so variable that it took this group about a year to develop this, and they developed a really innovative tool. So it's a circular calendar, goes around a year, but not in a fixed way. And here's a picture of it. You can see on the outer rim, there's an up arrow and a down arrow. The blue arc is the wet season, and the brown arc is the dry season. And because the dry season and wet seasons are really variable here, you can move those to have a longer wet season or a big drought. You can, in fact, make the whole year brown if it's a year with very little rain. And within that, there's a little hand which can be moved, and this is on the web at nakiloaina.com or .org. .com, actually, yeah. And you can move that hand and line up the months, it's the Hawaiian months, with the onset of the rains or the onset of the dry period. And within that, you can see there's a human cycle and a cycle of things that happen in the ocean and on the shoreline, and things that happen up in the uplands, and then things that are just atmospheric conditions.
So what does this actually help them do?
Well, it gives a framework for observing, and observing change is really critical. One of the things with climate change is that it tends to alter what people have always known about a place. I mean, that is the climate. The climate is whether Mark Twain called weather climate is what you expect and weather is what you get. So you expect something that's been a recurring pattern. And what this allows is, there's a good example of moving it to deal with when the rains start or when the dry seasons start. This allows people to kind of understand how the season this year is different from last year. And if, for instance, the ocean species start to change in how they're dealing with climate, and this is one of the predictions of climate change, is that it will stress certain species and they may not be able to reproduce, or their growing season may be really curtailed by conditions in the ocean. And so this gives the people of the land a way to observe those and log those changes, and over time build up a pattern of change that's occurring on their landscape. So it's a global look, a local look at a global phenomenon.
It's a little bit like the sort of citizen science projects.
Exactly. Yeah.
Especially like I'm familiar with one called Project Budburst, and you basically look at when things flower and fruit and so on, the phenology. And I think it's an interesting, this one is actually taking things a step further, and the community is actually logging that for themselves, whereas in something like Project Budburst, you go and
send
the data to some scientists somewhere, and they do stuff that you do, like what you scientists do.
The community here includes a lot of people that are quite highly trained, and they can do this themselves, and they've taken it upon themselves to build this into what the community does, so that they can actively observe change.
So what was Pixie's role in this?
We funded the study, the UH study, that actually allowed these people to get together, gave them a structure and some ideas, but most of this actually was community generated.
Okay, and then is this the sort of standard way that you work with other communities around the islands? Is it,
well,
do you have a different sort of, have you worked in a certain way and now are changing to other ways?
Yeah,
or?
we started out with the kind of general concept of the landscape conservation cooperatives, which is what Pixie is one of those, is that the problem was that people don't have enough information, so we need to do some science and then get the information out, and then they'll figure out what to do with that. We found that that's not really as good a model as the one we've taken on now, which is to ask people what their needs are and then develop programs that actually, and products that actually help them implement change on the ground. So it's much more of a manager focused, and the managers can be agency people, community people, whoever is actually implementing change on the ground and is able to affect change, those are the people we're trying to serve with products and services.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to come back to this in a second, but I just wanted to deviate a little bit and talk about this concept of biocultural conservation and how PIXI has sort of incorporated this into its workings with, you know, having someone like you at the science side, and then you've got a cultural adaptation coordinator as well. And what do you two do together, and how does that all work?
Well, I think we're unique among the LCCs across the nation, and it's actually an international network. But
and LCCs again are
landscape conservation cooperatives. Yeah,
right.
They're federally funded, but they're driven. Their mission is driven by the stakeholders themselves. So we have a 30-member steering committee that actually is what tells us what to do, and.
Wow, you have only 30 people telling you what to do?
30 organizations. That's, yes, a lot of bosses, but they're great. They work well together. Yes. But so Stanton Nanamoto is our cultural adaptation coordinator, and he, in fact, was one of the leads for this this Kaupalehu project. But by looking at these issues as not a natural science or a natural resources problem or a cultural problem, but an opportunity to work both together, because that's how people see their environment. They see the natural part of their environment, they see their activities within that, and they're part of a human ecological community with the natural world. And so by just taking that as a given and working both sides of that, both the natural science side and the cultural side, we can bring the most useful information to bear on and help people do what they need to do. It's a new problem, and they need new solutions.
And so it's not that one is divorced from the other, but you're really just working hand in hand as it should be.
Well, we found that climate change is such a new phenomenon that it's a puzzle both to the ecologists and the straight scientists, and it's also a problem for cultures. Neither group has a monopoly on knowledge because it's new territory for both. So now's the time to get together and solve the problem together.
And again, the community on the Big Island, I think, is a great example of that, where they took ancient knowledge, current knowledge, and knowledge that can take them into the future.
And they took charge of getting it together. Yeah.
That's right, yeah, that's fantastic. And so, and the other thing that I find about PIXI, which is so interesting, is that it works across local, federal, national agencies, as well as local and national organizations. Correct. And so it's got, those are all your members in there.
Right. The LCC initiative is from the Department of the Interior, which is a federal agency that has the Park Service and a science arm called USGS and the Fish and Wildlife Service and a whole bunch of other organizations. But we found that being part of a network, and the network has all of these organizations that impinge on it, we're very powerful across an enormous area.
Many hands make light work.
And make a lot of work, actually, but it's good work.
Well, and with that, I'm going to say thank you so much for joining us and for continuing to do such great work. We look forward to seeing all those birds coming back and to hearing those bird songs in our forests again.
Okay.
And for the rest of you, please come back. Join me next week to talk about sea level rise issues with Sam Lemo at the state DLNR. So Tuesday at 1 o'clock. Aloha, namaskar, and goodbye.